But I noticed the tend on the right towards, well, the tend actually everywhere. It's not just in America, throughout Europe and even Canada against, I would say not just illegal immigration. It's a kind of, honestly, a reaction to immigration as a whole. In my theory as to why that's happening is because increasingly as capitalism is in decline, the economy is in decline. There's less industry. They don't actually need as many laborers as they used to. And I think a lot of those capitalists are putting a lot of faith in AI. And now that like the immigrants aren't as necessary to them, they're like, oh, well, before you were cheap exploitable labor for me to use at will and a good reserve army of labor so I can underpay workers. And it's like, well, we don't need as many of you now. You can go fuck off. Like, because you know who adopted a sort of exterminist policy like this is Israel. Israel used to actually allow a lot of Palestinian migrants into Israel.
To be their exploited underclass, yeah.
And they're as an exploited underclass who had zero rights and were just like labor to be exploited. And they like to say, oh, well, we see, like, we have Palestinians here, lots of Palestinians, blah, blah. But like in the 2000s, as Israel developed into a more tech-oriented economy and a more service-oriented economy and less of a industrial economy, they needed that labor less, and they increasingly more went to a exterminist policy. Because I think when you see a trend that's global, that's happening in many countries, it's not just like a political choice. It's sort of, well, it's a political choice, but it's a political choice. It's a reflection of a changing material base.
I agree completely. Can I say one thing, which will be a little bit of fun, which would be, if you want the conspiracy theory that I think of the most, that I'm inventing right now, is that, isn't it fascinating that the moment that the Rust Belt deindustrializes is the moment when a synthetic opioid that's highly addictive and extremely lethal if overdosed on spreads throughout the, the Rust Belt and the Appalachian areas toward the surplus population. And the effect of this drug is to give you what? Euphoria, to make you kind of sleepy, and then you stop breathing. The fentanyl crisis, the synthetic opioid that spreads all throughout the surplus population, it kills millions of people who would be there and aggrieved and angry, are now being wiped out. It seems to be awfully convenient with the CIA's, long explicated history of being involved in drug trafficking. It's very interesting how there was a surplus that this fentanyl got here and spread just to wipe out these surplus populations. I'm not saying I actually believe it, but it is fascinating how, we have this crisis that killed hundreds of thousands of people every year in a population that is experiencing material deprivation, who have been completely disrupted and have lost their position in society and are no longer needed for capital because all that industrial base has been exported overseas. Then we have this convenient little drug crisis that kills them all, or kills large swaths of them.
I think
I'm not saying I actually think this conspiracy theory is true, but it is kind of fascinating that like sequence of events did take place, and it's like, maybe you could just blame despair for the rise of addiction or whatever, material displacement. People, they take a palliative and it is highly addictive and they die.
Well, some people say that about Canada too. Like, there's an argument that the genocide against natives is still happening. Some people say that, and because it just so happens that the native population in Canada, which still does exist, just all of the drugs happen to flow there the most. And, they get also like the worst drinking water in the whole country. They get like all of the worst conditions for living imaginable. And yet you have a progressive government who says like, oh, we have an indigenous person in the cabinet. Oh, we're so progressive. And he goes and cries and he does all that. I don't know,
like, can't
whether that's
intentional. Drinking water. That's so odd.
I haven't seen evidence that's intentional, but it might as well be, because
that's what I mean. It's almost having. It's like an antibody. It's an antibody of capitalism, where it's like, it's not even necessarily that it has to have some sort of like hands that are directing it, but it's like you have this surplus population, and then all of a sudden the conditions of extermination arise spontaneously. It's like the clearances, or it's like all this these periods of history where, but I think where these populations, these surplus populations exist, it's like the famine in Ireland, right? That was so useful to transport a population from where they were no longer needed towards a place where capital needed them to be, the United States, its factories. Like, it's very interesting how capitalism seems to create these human tragedies that just so happen to align with the needs of what capitalism, the system, needs in the moment.
She has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But your name wanna start changing your ways. Change your ways. Or changing your